Good morning, everyone. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Conversations with Rudy Rivera. Today, I am thrilled and honored to have with me Nirja Singh, who is an expert on generational diversity, a topic that's actually relatively new to me, but I find fascinating. Working with millennials and a floor with millennials as I do, I've come to appreciate through my conversations with Nirja how important it really is in the workplace. Nirja, thank you so much for coming on my show. I'm really grateful that you took the time out. You're in India right now, so it's what time is it in India?
It's 5:30 p.m. 5:30 in the
PM.
evening.
Okay.
Yes.
So Nirja, before we get into the conversation, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got to being the foremost expert on this topic?
Yes, Rudy, thank you. I appreciate this opportunity. This subject is really close to my heart. What happened was that in 2013, there were two personal incidents. And at that time, I didn't know that I would be studying and researching and talking on generational diversity. My husband is a fighter pilot. He's retired now, Rudy, but at that time, on the Air Force base, there was a MiG-21 crash. And the 25-year-old pilot, well, it was a fatal accident. The troubling thing about this tragic incident was that the cause of the crash came out to be social media addiction. That young pilot was up at night checking his feed. Now, this was unheard of, and this was really, really disturbing and shocking at that time because when we got married, my husband and I in 86, he very clearly told me that his sleep was very important because he's flying at least 2 to 3 sorties the next day. This came out of the blue. How does a fighter pilot stay up at night? That was one. And second, at that time, my 23-year-old daughter, who had all the check boxes ticked, what I called talent, parental support, education, Ivy League education, good looks, everything. And yet she began to slip into depression. It was a harrowing and a very dark period for us. Because these incidents were so surprising, I just began to look around, and the first thought that occurred to me was that these two young people are part of an ecosystem and what is happening in that ecosystem. So that is where I began to read up on this and speak on this. And eventually, now this is my fifth career. I've been in advertising, public relation, TV production, documentary filmmaking in the past, in journalism as well. But now I call myself a senior teenager. I call myself a millennial in spirit with the benefit of hindsight. And my aim now, Rudy, objective is to try and keep, firstly, young lives from spiraling out of control and also make sure that we leave behind a generation. I call them the 3 Ps that is more potent, more progressive, and more productive than us.
Well, we always want to
That's where
leave
it
the
is.
place better,
Yes,
than what we left it. What
absolutely.
what I so until I heard you speak at a previous event, I never really thought about generational diversity. So let's start talking about what are the generations and what are the age categories for them? Because
Right.
honestly, I had no idea. I mean, I knew I was a baby boomer, but beyond that, I'd never paid much attention. Can you categorize those for us?
Certainly. But I would like to begin with a disclaimer. I am in India, you are in another hemisphere. So the generations that we are going to discuss today broadly apply. However, there are differences, Rudy, from one culture to another. For example, what we call baby boomers in the West are actually are millennials because in India, the economic reforms came only in the 90s, and that is when we turned consumerist. So that generation, the one that was born in the 1990s, that's my elder daughter also, that was our first libertine generation. So shopping from off the rack, all this started at the time. the multinationals came in. So there will be minor differences, but for the sake of our discussion today, we'll consider the silent generation, which really I would call my grandparents perhaps that, born between 1925 to 1945. This is the silent generation. Then there are the baby boomers. I think you and I fit into that category, 1946 to 1964. And then along came the Gen X, the Generation X. As against the baby boomers, they're also sometimes referred to as baby busters. They were born in the 1965 to 1983. And then comes our famous, unfairly targeted millennials, the snowflakes as the media began to call them, born between 1984 and 1996. And then Gen Z, I call them the Zoomers. They live their lives in front of the Zoom. This is a generation that was born between 1997 and the mid 2000. And finally, the youngest generation that is just growing up now, emerging, is the alpha generation. From Z, we've gone back to alphabet A. This is a generation that was born in 2050 onwards. Now, Rudy, what is of interest other than the years? What is peculiar? What are the characteristics? What shaped these generations? A little bit about that quickly. The
Sure.
silent generation are usually considered to be frugal, resourceful, very grateful. They're brought up to be grateful for everything, also conservative. And well, one of the characteristics doesn't apply to everybody, but for the sake of understanding the differences, they save the wrapping paper at Christmas. Baby boomers, these kids, they grew up at a time of expansion, not depression. So the economy was swelling and they questioned everything. They were liberated and they experimented. That's when a lot of the famous music that we listen to, the flower power generation, the freedom of speech movement, all this happened with this generation. Then came the Gen X. Now, this generation came with the birth control. This is when the birth control pill entered the world. And they were raised by parents during the times of the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal. Millennials, as soon as the millennials came, the pattern became a little uniform because by then the internet was entering the world and we became hyper-connected. So parents all over the world were bringing up their children preoccupied with their safety, with their self-esteem and their status. And their life became very customized, my kind of peach, my kind of blue, my kind of tiramisu, and all of that. And entitlement also grew here because suddenly we were talking about participation trophies, unheard of before. And the young people that are entering the workforce today, the Gen Z, well, they have grown up in the wake of recessions, school shootings, pandemic, political polarization, and a lot of anxiety. Rudy, for this generation, mental health is their top problem. Mental health more important than their resume for this generation. So these summaries, they explain what these generations operate from, what kind of circumstances they came from that shaped their attitudes and their expectations and aspirations in life. Yes,
Something
Rudy.
I'm wondering as you speak is who thinks of these names?
There is a history to some of these names. To be honest, I don't remember who particularly decided, but I know how the alpha name was given, Rudy. But I can't recall the name of the person who carried out that research. A research was carried out, and there were these forms sent to a whole lot of people, and the general opinion was, okay, we are done with all the alphabets. We are at Z. Let's go back to A. That's how A was named. Boomers were named because of after the World War, there was a sudden boom, and people were having babies, and there was a population explosion. Then I said the Gen X came along. They were called the baby busters because by then I said, like I said, the birth control pill had come in. But millennials, of course, they came in towards the turn of the millennium. They also called the not the colonials. There's another name for them which I can't recall at this time. But then Gen Y, millennials, and then Gen Z, and then Gen Alpha. Yes, that's what I know about where the names came from, Rudy.
Somebody invents the name and then it sticks all over the world. But I've attended many seminars on
Yes.
diversity and inclusion, and honestly, you never hear about the age gap diversity. Why is it important?
Age gap diversity, I would go so far as to say that it is the single most critical diversity today, because the age diversity we live with today is unprecedented. We've never had 7 generations alive at the same time because of longevity and the medical advancement. We are living longer. There are more age groups living together and yet further apart. So I want to share with you some of the reasons why generational diversity has become so critical today. Now, you've heard and you would have seen in your work also that many managers today report a relational gap in the marketplace. Uh, there are identifying divided teams that communicate differently, teams that value different priorities. They have different definitions of work ethic and excellence. That is one. Second, it's important to understand that this gap is not just about style or music or experimentation or consumption. It's about language. It's about diversity, about inclusivity. In fact, it is about power structures. Hierarchy, as we knew it, does not exist anymore. There has been a collapse of authority. It's just that we have not acknowledged it at some levels and we haven't internalized it yet. Maybe we are blind to it still. But that is true. And another very peculiar thing that's happening today, Rudy, is that we are living in niches. We are living in very isolated groups. So one age group will mostly socialize with their own age group. It's almost as if the generations don't need each other to survive, or they don't need to be connected. They're not occupying the same space. And these subcultures, I would call them subcultures because today every generation has their own language, their own customs, their own preferences, prejudices, priorities. Every subculture between generations, there are these micro generations and tweeners, what you call. So it's important for families and for companies, for businesses and workplaces to acquire an insight into all these nuances in order to be able to bridge them and live happier and be more productive, because the way they are existing, I wouldn't say existing, coexisting today is not sustainable. They're not talking to each other. They're not leveraging each other's strengths. I think we all deserve better. So there's two more factors, Ruby. In fact, there are a couple of more. For example, marketing and individual choices. Individual choices have become so crucial today. What I want, what I prefer. In marketing, again, it's very important to have age diversity, because how do you expect a 45-year-old person to understand or know what a 25-year-old will or wants or likes, or what kind of, let's say a simple thing like what kind of cookies would they like in the coffee room. And remember, Rudy, the social dynamics that we are facing today. We have at
Absolutely,
35,
yes.
yes, at 35 today, you could feel old, and yet you're working until you're 75 and beyond. And a lot of people are unable to retire due to financial constraints. People are making career changes later in their lives, and some of us are still supporting our millennial children living at home. And lastly, remember, this diversity is crucial because it affects everybody, every single person, sooner or later. Unlike the gender diversity, unlike the ethnic diversity, this diversity is going to touch everybody, Rudy, which this is why age diversity is the most critical diversity today.
We have a comment, by the way, from one of our listeners. I think it was Douglas Copeland in his novel Generation X is how Generation X was named.
Okay, thank you.
And to anyone who's listening, feel free to type in any questions you may have. We're happy to answer them. I think part of the problem, maybe from being part of the baby boomer, is that we often feel that we're the ones who need to teach the younger generation, when in fact they can teach us a few things. And I think that's where the disconnect is, right? Can you elaborate a little more on that?
Absolutely. This is what you're referring to is something that the aware, the progressive, and up-to-speed companies are practicing today. It's called reverse mentoring, and it's making the most of each other's strengths so that everybody gains jointly. Now, remember, I mentioned how power is moving younger. So you have founders of unicorns who are very young, 31 maybe, and at 41 they are CEOs. But as such, Rudy, there is no microwave out there in the market yet for leadership skills. So what can the seniors bring here? What can the seniors bring to these young people so that they are able to run enduring businesses? Now, accumulated EQ, emotional intelligence, specialized knowledge. The senior lot has the ability to teach, to coach, and to counsel. What can the youth bring? Well, energy, creativity, innovative thinking, lots of enthusiasm. And the older generation can learn from the young to speak their mind without feeling hesitant, because the young offer suggestions. They have ideas on how the current processes can be changed and how we can implement the new ones. So having both the generations together will also encourage the older lot to speak up and become more active. Now, I read something very beautiful. It said, our young may need us for the timeless values and virtues that make civilization work, but we may need them to envision where the future is taking us. I also want to share here with everybody who's listening in, how specifically can each generation contribute to this joint culture? So baby boomers, life experience, awareness of pitfalls, I call it benefit of hindsight. The Gen X, realistic perspective, pragmatic wisdom, balance, and resourcefulness. Millennials will bring energy, tech savviness, optimism, and they're also socially far more connected. They're quite confident. Gen Z, they have a hacker mindset, entrepreneurial and social justice warriors. They are social media savvy, and they also have a new, fresh, refreshing view on everything. So imagine an organization, Rudy, where all these four are contributing their strengths, and it would be a happy workplace that is over delivering. What else would you want?
There's an interesting story, well, from a movie. I don't know if it's true, if it was intended as to make a point, but there's a truck that can't go under a bridge, and you have all these engineers who are trying to figure out how to get the truck through under the bridge. And finally, a little girl says, why don't you let the air out of the tires? And they let the air out and drove the truck out So that's a good example of young people will often have the solution. But too often we as
Absolutely.
older people think, what do they know? Well, what do they know? There's no way they can have that experience, but they do have perception, they have intelligence. And something I'd like you to talk about is we often perceive the young people as not being smart, not intellectually, but smart because they have no experiences. How can they know? They've never lived through this.
Today, the kind of agency and the kind of autonomy that young people have, that device has given them in their hands, it's unprecedented. So they have YouTube that can tell them how to do virtually anything. That's the instinctive reflex action these days. You talk of anything, I'll go to YouTube and check how it can be done. And then you have social media to take whatever you have created to wherever you want to send it. So there are young people with phenomenal stories where have come up with these brilliant ideas and they're making money just with the help of YouTube and the social connection, the social reach. So today the radius has grown that much bigger. The range is that much more, and well, literally the world is their oyster. Any young person, 10-year-old, 12-year-old. So you have all these, the Instagram
Mhm.
millennials, they're making, yes. So all this is coming from technology. Technology, internet is what is empowering them. So today it doesn't matter, Rudy, really, how young, how old you are. It's becoming quite level.
There was a former worker at my company, is Chinese. He learned, he's actually a medical doctor by training, but in this country not able to practice yet. He looked on YouTube to fix the
Mm.
timing belt in his automobile and did it himself. So there are a lot of
Abs-
people who are just going to the YouTube to learn things, which is a new way of learning. Because when I was studying law, the only way you could learn is to go to a book in a library or order the book. But now you've got the knowledge of the world at your fingertips.
Absolutely. And if you're able to filter it, if you're able to type the right search words in the, in that space there, and you know what you're looking for, you can really, really leverage it. And if you can stay in I mean, you can kind of prevent yourselves getting distracted. We get distracted a lot when we go onto the screen and open Google or open any of these YouTube channels. But if you can be indistractable, then certainly you can do a whole lot. You can be very, very productive with all this.
Well, before we get into the benefits, what are the benefits of hiring? Can we talk a little bit about what's important to each of them? I mean, and some of these categories overlap. So as I understand it, for example, Generation C, a primary preoccupation is student debt assistant, company raises and financial incentives, financial advice, employee resource group, but what you talked about earlier, flexibility, which is key, reimbursement for tuition. Millennials think, it says also assistant with student loan, but they're at the point where they're having babies, so daycare is an important issue. Mortgage services, monetary gifts, flexibility, mental health, career development. Generation X, similar, tuition reimbursement, on-site daycare, wellness programs. So some of these overlap. But what are can you briefly go over what the significant differences in need for each generation?
Yes, certainly, Rudy. You covered some of them, but let me talk about for example, let's see what would motivate them. So for a baby boomer, you would want a position, a bonus, or the corner office, or a cabin. What about Generation X? They would like perhaps freedom to work on their own terms. And for millennials, impact has been very important. So it's not about life, it's about meaningful work that makes a difference to other people's lives, to the world. And for Generation Z, it's becoming, let me do it on a screen and my way. And similarly, just as their expectations at work are different, similarly, their attitude towards, let's say, change in companies, when change happens, change comes, each generation will handle it differently. So for a baby boomer, for instance, your attitude would probably be, well, it was fine the way we did it in the past. And for Gen X, it could be, I, I like it when it's my own idea, when the change is my idea. And Rudy, for a lot of millennials, they like change. So I think they welcome change, generally speaking. And for Gen Z, we all know that the attention span, because they're multitasking a whole lot, they're on the phone a lot. So similarly, all the generations differ, Rudy, in the way they communicate, in the way they receive feedback and evaluation, because they're all products of their time. They're all products of the technologies that raised them. So there was this generation when the TV came, then the Nokia phone came with the T9 texting, and then along came the internet. And today we have the smartphone, and we have Alexa, we have Google, we have Siri, we have all of that. From electronics, we've gone into robotics. So this is how the change comes, and we are seeing the outcomes, the different expectations all around us. In fact, attitude to authority also, Rudy, even that is very, very different with each generation.
I'm waiting for the next level, which is a chip in the head. Have a chip in your head,
Absolutely.
and you don't need the phone. Just you can think it.
Immortality, where you upload your brain onto a cloud. And there are reports that it's been attempted and done by some people who could afford it. A lot of the
Well,
tech titans are
yes,
angry at being mortal. They'd like to be immortal. So yes,
yeah.
that's the next, and we are entering that. We're already living in a very AI infested space, AI influenced, infected space.
It's amazing, and there are movies about artificial intelligence taking over the world. You know that
Yes.
because mankind is inefficient. And,
Uh,
movies often predict what are going to happen in the future, even though it's fantasy. The man on the moon was in many movies before we actually got to the moon.
Absolutely. And this is a cue for me, Rudy, to share something. You just mentioned about AI taking over our lives. Let's for a moment talk about this generation that's coming up, which is going to be the most tech immersed generation, and that's the alpha generation. And I don't know if you heard, you may have seen this WhatsApp doing the round where one of the alpha generation kid, a digital age kid, is stroking a hard book, a hardback book, and stroking it as though it were an iPad with a touch screen, trying to make it move, not realizing they've never seen a traditional book. They don't know you have to open it to look at the pictures. So imagine this generation. And parents who are raising this generation, uh, incidentally, this is going to be the largest generation. When I say largest, not in America, it's going to be the largest because mostly in the world, and a lot of children in Africa and Asia. And it's also important for businesses, and it's already happening, that research is already happening to observe them, to try and understand them, and be prepared to raise them, to lead them, to support them, to nurture them, all of that. And incidentally, this generation is also the generation that gets impatient with Alexa and, well, throws a tantrum with Alexa. Why isn't Alexa responding the way they want Alexa to respond?
Well, it's
Yeah.
it's like FaceTime is now passe. You know,
Yes.
all that technology changes. I saw an interesting cartoon that my friends will send me these cartoons, and one of
Hmm.
them is two phones, an older cell phone and a younger cell phone. And there's a
Okay.
picture of in a it's an art museum of a regular phone, and the older phone says to the younger phone, "You see, my son, our ancestors had
Mm.
tails." referring to the core. So,
Yes.
so it's
Yes.
really kind of, that's the, things get old faster. There's dog years, one per every 7 years. And I call it, there's computer technology years, in 6 months, the
Yes.
technology is obsolete. And I think the alpha generation is the one that's going to keep track of that stuff. But the older generations have to learn it. And that's the implication there. When I hung out a shingle out of law school, I paid $1,000 for a fax.
Hmm.
It was a single Hitachi thermal paper. We could only feed, because it was used, we could only feed one paper at a time. And my law partner was 3 years older, was screaming at me saying, "What's wrong with the post office? What's wrong with
Wow.
the US mails? I mean, why do you have to spend money on this stuff? You like these gadgets." He was the first one to get the fax, and he used the fax machine more than anybody in the office. It allowed him to move
Yes.
his cases quicker. So
Hmm.
there is resistance to technology by the older people. And
Yes.
that's where I think the older generations need to change, and they need to embrace it. Some people do it, some people don't.
Yes. And they get left behind. There was the horse lobby that was up in arms when the tractors came in, and how coffee was banned because it facilitated dissent or debate. So this has been a story, mankind's story. But today, what we need to understand, Rudy, is it's a cause for concern also, because you're talking about age diversity and how the subsequent generations, what kind of leadership will they need? What will their challenges be? For instance, the generation that is going to come up now, remember that anxiety in preschool, and a lot of my generation and Gen X, the next generation, they wonder, why would a preschooler be anxious? But remember that they are drowning in unfiltered information. How do you keep a preschooler away from news of the war in Ukraine? And what can
Well,
be more poignant than
sure.
to have a young person say today that they may not have the luxury of dying of old age. The climate could kill them.
The shootings
That
at the
is,
schools, they don't
yes,
feel safe
and
going to school.
that is something which is a cause for concern. This is not the order of nature. It's not how things are supposed to be, which is why I say that our mandate is to leave behind a generation that is better, stronger, more healthier, and more wholesome than us. And is that happening? And if it's not happening, then let's identify why not and make those changes that we need to.
So I think that's why people who live through the Depression, um, say to the young, what do you have to be stressed about? In my day, I think
Exactly.
those are the
Exactly.
worst things you can say. Well, in my day, that's what we did. There's a great song by Mike and the Mechanics, Living Years, and it's every generation blames the one before. Those are some of the
Yes.
lyrics to that. And the younger generation think we don't know anything, but we do know something still. So that's where the harmony comes in, which brings me to my next question. What are the benefits of age gap diversity or age diversity?
Age diversity benefits are huge, huge, huge. Uh, it's very important for generations to live together in the same space. That's not happening enough in companies and businesses. Mixed age work teams will solve complex problems better, and which will lead to increased productivity. So that's benefit number one. Then also improved skill diversity. So they're the older people with stronger interpersonal skills. A lot of young people have trouble with their interpersonal relationships, how to cultivate and to maintain deeper relations. In fact, something interesting about what is to come at us is the generation alpha, that is the one generation which is likely to have more digital relationships than human relationships. So just imagine, just visualize that for one. So improved skill diversity, that is another benefit. Then there are mentorship opportunities if you have several generations working together. And of course, for that, the company culture, you have to value continued learning and all the skill building. Employee retention is better because, for one, the older generation are, they've just grown up to be more loyal, they stick around longer. So the high employee turnover, which is costly, damaging, that can probably be reined in. Innovation because of the younger employees. And also remember that it gives companies an opportunity to diversify their benefits because we value different things. Now, young may want to work remotely, whereas the old may be keen on company equity or pension plans. So here's an opportunity for companies to diversify the benefits that they offer. And finally, age diversity fights stereotyping that the old are frail, they are incompetent, they are technologically inept, they are resistant to change, all of that. And that the kids, the younger ones, are entitled, they're disrespectful, they are lazy, they are snowflakes, and they have all these, demands and expectations, and they want a raise in their first year and promotion right away, all of that. So more the diversity, these are the benefits that you can accrue from a workforce that looks like this.
Have
Primarily, these
they
are the
been able to quantify that? For example, in the normal diversity and inclusion conversations, I think McKinsey Corporation puts out a study that says companies that are diverse and inclusive are 19% more profitable. But I don't think they deal with age gap diversity. Have you seen any statistics on those?
I've seen only one statistic, and that said that uh, according to PricewaterhouseCoopers, only 8% of organizations include age as part of their diversity and inclusion strategies. So that is the statistics that I have. Although most of us understand that diversity is important and it contributes to the overall functioning of an organization, but only 8% are aware and conscious of including age diversity. And also remember the other side of the coin, that ageism today is the most common form of prevalent prejudice today. And a 150 of Silicon Valley's biggest tech companies, they have been faced with accusations of age bias over the past decade, rather than gender or racial bias. And the US has, you will know this, Rudy, the Age Discrimination Employment Act of 1967. There is
Exactly, yeah.
nothing like that. There is nothing like that in India. We don't have any such protection. There's just a common law that you can file this under. And one thought is that we were discussing diversity, but if you look at it, more deeply, actually speaking, diversity should not exist, because if you treat people well, inclusion ought to happen automatically. It would happen automatically because right values are evergreen and every age brings those values.
That's the key, really.
Yes, yes, that's the key.
Treat everyone well. That I think will solve many problems. There's a good book. I'm trying to remember the author said everything I needed to know I learned in kindergarten. Play nice.
Yes,
Um,
yes.
that's the most basic key. I'm a little familiar with age discrimination. I've tried a few cases in my career, and the protected age, unless the laws change, and if there are any lawyers out there who are more up to date on it than I am, it was anything suspect class is 40, and it was 40 and above. So if you were 40 and above and you were fired, then you have what they call a case that can go to the jury on whether or not you were discriminated. Now, it may have changed. This was 25 plus years ago when I tried these cases. So yeah, there's no really protection for the young, although you can't discriminate because of age. I don't think you can put an ad in the paper, only people between 45 and 50, and 60 apply.
There's there's the other end of this, the other side of this coin, Rudy. For instance, I call them the excluded majority. Who is the excluded majority today? Actually, the young, because even in India, in the parliament, the representation, the average age of the parliamentarian, it just is, it's crazy. Not enough young voters vote because they feel unheard, because they don't see their age represented in the parliament. I think it's a phenomenon all over the world, but gradually it is changing because, again, there is a stereotypical attitude and perception of the young people as naive, or they don't know enough. But the thing is that their world is different. They know more. They know
They
more.
know
So
more
when you
than
talk,
the old people. They have
they know
access to
more.
them.
And
They have to, yeah.
exactly. And when you're talking about bridging, for example, I call myself the Gen Bridger. But what is a Gen Bridger? Gen Bridger is not a bridge that I'm trying to construct from me to the next generation. No, the bridge we are talking about is the one that starts from where that generation is today and where they want to be next. Because really, your role and my role, or the role of the earlier generations, is to guide. Is to guide. So no more a manager, now be a mentor. Invest in them. Because remember, this is a situation where the younger generation has a trust deficit with traditional institutions, the government, the corporate, the educational institutions. And
But
but do we understand that, Rudy? Do we appreciate that many of them, again, this, you cannot apply this to everybody, but we are speaking of trends. Here is a generation that feels that they can trust only perhaps somebody, an older person that they know. So interpersonal relations. But they can't trust an institution. They can't trust the airlines. They can't trust the pharmaceutical companies because there have been all these frauds. So this is a kind of environment. Therefore, you're bridging, helping them create bridges from where they are to where they want to go. That's a bridge. Another one we traditionally think of as a bridge.
But I
However,
think bridge is a two-way street, though. The bridge is a two-way street. And I think, I started reading on this, and it's how we need to listen to the millennials, how we need to listen to these people. They have something to offer. I think the reverse is also true. The millennials do need to listen in some cases to the wisdom of the older generation. And that's where the communication comes into play. And that's where the mentoring comes in. You're not only teaching the millennial, but the millennials teaching you. And that's where it's got to be a two-way. It's not never going to be a one-way bridge. It's the bridge that traffic goes both ways.
I would say, Rudy, that they will listen to the older generation when there is a feeling of connection, when they feel connected from the heart, when there is real concern. Anything prescriptive will not work. That's been my experience. It's not worked with my children. It's not worked with young people around me.
Well, but
Yes,
that's a very basic thing, is connecting.
yes.
Whether it's generational or whether it's people among the same generation, you need to connect. If you don't connect, you're never going to communicate. There's never going to be the trust. So to me, the interpersonal connection, the trust, is important, not everywhere else, but seems to be even more important in this generation gap, because there seems to be a huge mistrust on both sides. The older people don't trust the younger generation because they think, well, you really don't know, you don't have the experience. The younger generation thinks, well, you're outdated, you're not up to date, you really don't know, you don't understand what I'm going through. So there's that, because there's a disconnect. And when that connect comes and they trust each other, I think then the communication comes more often. Has that been your experience in the generation bridging that you're doing?
Well, there's a presumption here that the old structures will endure, the old social structures will endure. But what about a situation where young people don't necessarily feel the need for their biological family and are creating families of their own outside their biological families? It is happening. The young people not marrying, or young people, when they marry, they decide not to have children. We have these assumptions, I think, the older generations, that this is the path, these are the milestones, this is how we did it, this is how it's probably going to be done now. But I think we're too good to be more sensitive to the real problems or real challenges that these young people face and how they're trying to solve them. Because I know my daughter is a lawyer. I know that there is talk there of even leave wills, for example. Now, the technicalities you would know more Rudy here, but a situation where you can leave what you have to not necessarily a biological successor, to a friend, or creating these communities, which are families in every sense, which were very an idea which was very foreign to me, would be to my generation. So
We
we
have a really
continue
good
something
question.
different.
Nirja, we have a really, really good question from one of our
Yes.
listeners, and that is, do you have any ideas on how companies can foster generational integration activities, question mark, team building, question mark, intergenerational teams? That's a great question. Thank you, Alejandra, for asking that question.
Specific team building, team activities. What I would say to that, Rudy, is that there are several ways. You're talking about integrating the generational differences in the workplace.
Right.
So one is just discussing those activities. But here, this question to me translates into, it has to start with a comprehensive hiring strategy, and leaders understanding the benefits of an age diverse workforce. For instance, we could do a game right here. Let me try and play a game here. And before I just play that game, let me play that with you, Rudy. And but before that, a couple of other points. You could also focus on onboarding, employee onboarding, and implement a workplace mentorship program. And of course, you speak to the staff all the time about working relationships, challenges, and teamwork, for instance. Now, one of the activities, just off the cuff, Rudy, let's talk about what a common leader would do in the past and what the new leader, generationally aware leader, would do today. So if a common leader said, listen to me when I speak, what would the new leader say? The new
I
leader would
will,
say,
a new leader would say, you mean to the old leader?
no, to the young generation, to the workforce, to a generationally diverse workforce.
Uh,
Ideally, the new leader would say, speak to me and I will
and listen,
listen.
and I will listen,
Yes.
exactly, listening.
An old leader would say, I know the answer already. But the new leader would say, no, I'm seeking new alternatives. This is
Well,
a
that's,
this is
yeah, that's very common. I mean, all over the world, in the sense that, you know, what I've learned is to be a good leader is to be a servant, but also to be a good listener. It's the same with being a
Mhm.
lawyer. To be a great lawyer, you have to be a good listener. Listening is
Yes.
critical everywhere, but that is a very good point. Yes. And when
In the past, yes.
go ahead. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Uh, for instance, it would be the leader would figure things out for himself, but today it's let's collaborate and the best idea wins, right? Or it used to be never let them see you sweat, but now it is being about being authentic or being vulnerable. So this is a different
Mhm.
way of communicating. For instance, a generationally unaware leader would be, I'm the only teacher on this team, but of course this is the most common one. And now we say we're all lifelong learners. And just because I have more experience, so I know best. But today it is, since we are older, since you and I are older, we are willing to work to adapt.
The intergenerational teams really fascinates me. That question does, because you're obviously not going to see, unless it's a young, some tech startup, you're not going to see young people on the board of a public company necessarily. Okay. You're not going to see young people in
Mm.
in senior management. Um, so I think it'd be difficult to set up those intergenerational teams at those levels, although I think they should. I'm not saying they shouldn't. I'm saying the way it's structured, it's the older people who tend to be the senior managers or the ones who make the senior decisions. But what would you recommend if you were advising me, say I'm president of a big company, how would I set up an intergenerational team? What's the best way to do it? Or what would you recommend?
I would say that, like I just mentioned, that your hiring strategies, you devise a hiring strategy, be age smart, and very consciously pick and choose when you're hiring and look at the age, make that a factor. For instance, there's that example of Burberry, the company that was running in losses, and that they had this young new CEO. And what did she do? What did she do? She identified how they could utilize social media and how she made it possible for people to upload their photographs wearing Burberry products. And suddenly the image of the company changed and they just, their profits grew. And there are examples of the millennial whisperers in, was it in Philippines, where they carried out this experiment. It didn't succeed entirely, but they did have young people join the government, millennials join the government, and counsel the leader. So all over the world, I think there are in pockets leaders who are, or governments or companies who are trying this out, who are leveraging the youth's ideas because they are more in touch with what the market needs or what is out there. So a comprehensive strategy, hiring strategy, where you have people hiring who understand and appreciate the benefits of an age diverse workforce. I'm not too sure that is happening as much as it should be. And like I said, implement a mentorship program and speak constantly to the staff about how the relationships and the teamwork and all of that is important, because that is what is going to keep people happy and working and productive.
So so the
What are
hiring
the,
is, yeah, the
yes,
hiring is great, but then once you hire, you need to then to
yes,
do the training. You can't just hire them, expect to throw them in there and say they're not
absolutely,
doing anything. So you got to
absolutely.
train them to be sensitive to each other and how to communicate with each other, right?
That will come
That's,
up in your employee onboarding, when you're doing your onboarding, when you're doing your team integration, all that comes in there, Rudy.
and then there's the mentoring part of it, which is not just for the younger employee, but also for the older, because you have to learn how to communicate efficiently, right? And you have to be able to
Yes,
work together. Mentoring is that way. The other, I think, issue that's important is resolve any conflict as soon as you can. Do not let them linger. Okay.
absolutely.
We
Hmm.
have another good question. I'm going to get into it. Let me go through these other 2 points. Resolve the conflicts you can. Listen to the employees is key. We talked about that, and use personalized coaching. I'm just giving like takeaways that people can get from this, and that is try different communication styles is another, because we all know they
Yes,
communicate differently, and look for commonalities. And that's something I want to get into more detail on in the time we have remaining. But the question is, as an older job searcher, one of the challenges that I face is larger corporations are using HR systems which make the HR function
mm,
anonymous. Age discrimination runs rampant with HR present and
absolutely.
actively involved. Any suggestions?
There, Rudy, the HR system, I think you are a better person to answer that, because I know that in a lot of cases it is automized and you just get filtered out. So A company that would be age smart would adopt unconventional ways of hiring. For instance, for older people, what they studied 40 years, 30 years ago, it really doesn't matter anymore. So it's who they are at that point. So let's say you just adopt a novel method of just asking them to write in the statement of purpose. I'm just throwing an idea. So something unconventional like that, use that to hire people, older people. Devise
Mhm.
new, different, and relevant methods of hiring, not the regular traditional ones that we still continue to utilize.
Well, I agree with this person who asked the question. The problem is that the hiring practices are often so mechanized and they
Yes.
have certain stereotypes. For example, at my age, at 68,
Mm.
somebody's not going to want to look at me and say, "You're ready to retire," where I've got at least another good 10 years. There's longevity in my family. And so you get booted for that. So somebody who's really young, you're not ready for this position. Oh, you don't have the exact experience that we need. Therefore, we're going to hire somebody with the exact experience, and they don't take into account the skills are transferable. So there's
Yes.
I think in the gender gap, there are skills that are transferable. You know, when you've got a millennial who's got these skills, they can be transferred to the subject matter expertise of the company of what they want the person to do, but you can't teach them the millennial skills. And the millennial can't learn unless he or she are willing to open their minds and say, well, this old guy knows something. Let me see what I can learn from him also.
Yes. See, these problems in hiring and all this will get easier only when the environment is up to speed with the need for generational diversity. And that is what we are also, in a manner, doing with this particular interview. You talk more about this. I just said that only 8% companies are approaching age diversity and trying to apply that, adopt that in their businesses. So the more the awareness, the the lesser of these problems we are going to face, like the one that was just described, Rudy.
It is
So I think
incredible.
it's a part.
Yeah,
Yes.
I know. I think it's a good question. We had a couple good questions, and I think it all goes back to communication and listening to each other and networking. Those are the primary
Uh,
things. Go ahead.
Rudy, if I want to go back to, there was a question on team activities, and something just popped into my head. I want to suggest something. For instance, generational games based on generations. For instance, all of us have grown up with a very typical kind of music or typical gadgets. So you could have these games where you're asking the other generation to guess uh, let's say the name of a particular star who was famous at that time, or a particular cartoon, or a particular film, or a particular product that used to be the favorite back then. So there are tons and tons of activities that you can do around generations.
Like Trivial Pursuit, right?
Yes.
Trivial Pursuit is
Whoa,
generational.
true. Yes.
Um, well, we're approaching the hour, and I just really want to thank you for taking the time. I know you're extremely busy. I think this is a great topic. I think it's important now more than ever with these divides and generations. Um, I really want to thank you for doing. I want to thank the people who've attended, and please subscribe to my channel on YouTube. There are going to be many more interviews, and we'll probably have more interviews on this topic so we can, we can spread the word. So